You're listening to DruidCast episode 181.
A glimmer in the dark above, wings to dark beneath. Hey you, 86, you. Why don't you tell me what you're going through?
Hello my friends and welcome to DruidCast episode 181. I am your host Dave the Bard, and DruidCast is brought to you on or around the 20th of the month by the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. If you want to find out more about the Order and our courses, you can do that on our website at www.druidry.org. Opening this show, you heard Sedna by Lazuli Vane from the album The Orphic Rite of the Cult of Sedna. What an amazing groove. And you know, that kind of sets the scene for this episode of DruidCast. We are heading to the Mediterranean this month with a talk by Sam R. Garrity given at March's Wild Witchcraft Conference all about Prometheus. Now, Sam goes very deep, and if you are into your Greek gods, you might want to have a notebook handy because there is a lot of information in this talk. So, as is traditional to our right, grab that cuppa, sit back, and enjoy Sam R. Garrity as he talks about Prometheus.
The Talkie Bit.
I hope you can all hear me there. Thank you for the introduction. Just a little bit background on this project. I'm sure the month and year of March 2020 lingers for many of you, and it was at that time, unbeknownst to me, that I was made effectively redundant, and I thought, well, you know, how am I going to put this to good use? I realised I had a few subscriptions on various sort of academic websites, and I had some other stuff that I could pilfer, as well as books that I already owned. And so I started in earnest. I'm hoping one day that this talk is already a lot of material. I'm hoping that eventually it will end up in a book. It's not going to be yet. But needless to say, a figure as large and as worldly as Prometheus, you know, there are literally so many different elements to the myth of Prometheus that each and every one of them could easily make a talk in and of itself. So there are, that's kind of like, you know, me trying to say that if I haven't managed to cover everything, then you know, please be aware that it's because of you know, it is within an hour to cover a figure the size of Prometheus. So I feel like I've condensed in the best way that I can to the bits that are most relevant. So Prometheus, nearly 3,000 years after the first recorded literature, and mentioning his name, Prometheus, whose name essentially means forethought, continues to inspire generations of poets, novelists, artists, musicians, philosophers, scientists, philologists, those are people who work with language, occultists and humanists. His motives still endure. A Titan god, and defied a new order of younger Olympian gods by stealing fire on behalf of man and suffering a harsh punishment as a consequence, or so the general narrative goes. As with many archaic mythologies, there are a number of different versions. As I say, his etymology in the classical realm is disputed, but the commonly held view is that his name essentially means forethought. And I'm not sure if you can see that, but that you have here, he is the son of Iapetus and Clymene, okay? He had actually three other brothers. Atlas is mentioned there. Epimetheus actually means afterthought, and so he stands in juxtaposition to his brother. There is also another brother, less spoken about, called Menetius. Now, Menetius is quite an interesting character because he kind of defines the more reckless element of the kind of Titanic pantheon. He was a really reckless figure. He was kind of considered to be a great example of a Titan god overstepping their remit. In fact, that is, I was told by somebody from Oxford, a lecturer at Oxford, actually precisely what is often one of the interpretations of the word Titan is overstepping one's remit. I'd also like you to note there that Atlas is the grandfather of Hermes. There'll be plenty on Hermes later on. The earliest written source we have from Prometheus comes from the late 8th century BC theogony of the poet Hesiod. Prometheus, whose name, as I say, translates as forethought, is the son of Iapetus and Clymene and Oceanide. Okay? This translation, by the way, just going off, the Amiel West is fantastic. Okay? There are many out there, some of them written, 19th, 20th century, but the Amiel West is really, really magnificent, much more modern than many. Okay, so a little bit about Epimetheus there. Okay, meaning afterthought as a juxtapose. A quick Platonic interlude is perhaps here useful. According to Plato, both Epimetheus and Prometheus were given the task of creating man and animals, and in regards to this feat, Epimetheus asked that he should be responsible for the distribution of all qualities, and that Prometheus should be responsible for the inspection, presumably after their distribution. Epimetheus, however, made the blunder of equipping too many attributes to the animal kingdom before the creation of man had ever taken place, and so man was left with less. This led in turn to Prometheus having to steal fire on behalf of man from the workshop of Hephaestus and Athena. Okay, more on them later. Okay, to make up for the shortfall of attributes caused by this disastrous Epimethean afterthought. This account, however, is at odds with the much earlier theogony, as mentioned, where Prometheus essentially steals fire in retribution because Zeus withholds it from man. But Zeus doesn't just withhold fire from man. He does so because of, according to Hesiod anyway, a prior offence committed by Prometheus, the rebel Prometheus. Okay. Now, this former offence took place at a place called Mekon, where a trick devised by the wily Prometheus deceived Zeus into choosing ox bones concealed in the pleasing exterior of the animal's stomach. It was this that led to the son of Kronos, Zeus, withholding fire from man, okay, as a consequence of punishment. Okay, and this is opposed the role of Epimetheus in the Platonic version. And I will say that it should go without saying that the Hesiod predates Plato by quite some time, irrespective of the fact that Plato is an incredibly influential character. Hesiod, however, is not overly complimentary in his assessment of what he considers the lowly, crafty figure of Prometheus, regarding him as a scheming, crooked figure who fails miserably to outwit Zeus at a first attempt, which took place at the con. Now, an interesting little interlude here. A good friend of mine, Mr. Jake Stratton-Kent, a Goetic magician, we were once having a little bit of a chat about Prometheus, and he pointed out to me, and it was so glaringly obvious, that actually Prometheus didn't really exist in a world where Zeus was ultimately supreme, was ultimately omniscient, ultimately omnipotent, because Prometheus knew things about him. Prometheus was able to trick Zeus. And so you're kind of left with this idea that perhaps, not only the trickery, but actually this kind of narrative that Hesiod, the very austere Hesiod, gives across this Zeus world is perhaps made more of talk than actual reality, given by the example of Prometheus. Son of Iapetus, clever above all others, you are pleased at having stolen fire and outwitted me, a great calamity both for yourself and for men to come. To set against the fire, I shall give them an affliction for which they will all delight as they embrace their own misfortune. Okay? In Hesiod's later didactic poem, Works and Days, the anger of Zeus is related in more detail, and this scourge of mankind is revealed to be that of Pandora. And I did say earlier that each and every aspect of the Prometheus myth could be a talk in itself. Pandora is one such example, and so there is very little in this talk, unfortunately, about her, and I will come back to her hopefully at a future date. Again, it's Epimetheus in this Hesiodic version used as a vehicle for this deception as a fool who takes Pandora for a bride, after Zeus had crafted for mankind woman via what I'm calling a full Olympian valet. And this is a little bit from the Works and Days. So he ordered, and they all obeyed the Lord Zeus, son of Kronos, at once the renowned ambidexter, that's Hephaestus, by the way, ambidexter, moulded from earth the likeness of a modest maiden by Cronus' son's design, and the pale-eyed goddess Athene dressed and adorned her. The Graces and the Lady Temptation put necklaces of gold about her body, and the lovely-haired spirits of likeness garlanded her about with spring flowers. Pallas Athene arranged all the adornment on her, in her breast to go between the dog-killer, that's Hermes, fashioned lies and wily pretences, and a navish nature by deep thundering Zeus's design. And he named this woman Pandora, all gift, because all the dwellers on Olympus made her their gift, a calamity for men who live by bread. So the Works and Days is an example of a myth used essentially to describe how an insurgent has managed to upset the natural order of things from a perfected state, an inertia, an uncreation. A great many parallels perhaps to the Garden of Eden. Moving on. Aristotle, in what's widely considered to be the first treatise on literary theory, in his 4th century Poetics, suggests that those serious poets of yesteryear, such as Hesiod, Homer, who was notable by his absence in the Prometheus, really in regards to anything written about Prometheus, suggests that those serious poets of yesteryear who had once written epic, Hesiod and Homer will both be epic poetry, now veer toward a newer, more worthy form known as tragedy. And it's to tragedy now that we turn. So, moving from about 750 BC, around about the time that Hesiod was writing, we now shift to the 5th century tradition of Athenian tragedy. And most notably, the playwright Aeschylus. Okay? Now, one little background here. E.F. Watling, mid-20th century scholar, classical scholar and philologist, suggests that a great many of the people who went to Athenian theatres were already quite well acquainted with the myths. It wasn't like going to the cinema where you don't know what's going to happen with the film. They were very acquainted with the narrative, with the philosophy, with the questions that each of these myths were afforded. But actually, what people were interested in going along was almost like a sort of dialogue going on. They were interested in the particular spin that a playwright would give. Now, Aeschylus was really successful in what were essentially these competitions. Okay, now he is getting back to essentially what we have here. He wrote the Prometheus Bound. The Prometheus Bound, like all plays at this time, was originally part of a trilogy. Sadly, the Prometheia, or the other 2 parts of the trilogy, as long as a satire play, along with a satire play, have been lost to us. I will come back to that a little bit later. But essentially, it's really interesting. I guess one of the differences between Aeschylus and Hesiod is by the time that Aeschylus has come to the fore, some 250, 300 years later, the Prometheus Bound really starts to actually put the focus onto Zeus himself. Okay, so it's no more about this wily, lowly, crafty figure of Prometheus that Hesiod would have a stink. Hesiod would never, ever have brought Zeus's behaviour into question. It would just be unthinkable. But by the time that Aeschylus comes along, that started to happen. And so some of the focus ends up being on Zeus's behaviour. Okay, and perhaps this is the beginning of where many modern commentators start to see the kind of the beautiful rebel inherent in Prometheus. You know, the kind of this almost like a saviour figure, and a little bit more on that later. So the Prometheus Bound, the one play that still exists, the play begins in Medea's Ceres, which is in the middle of things, with the figure of Violence, who is mute, and Strength, who is there goading both Prometheus and Hephaestus to do his duty and chain Prometheus to the rock. Kratos and Bia, Strength and Violence. Prometheus is first visited at the rock by the chorus of the daughters of Oceanus, who briefly commiserate with Prometheus. They both express anger at his state, okay, from that of a god to his current wretched state. Oceanus arrives at the scene with an equal measure of pity and concern over not so much the fact that Prometheus has been chained to the wall, to a rock, but because of Prometheus. His first concern is Prometheus' disobedience in the face of Zeus. So perhaps, not quite as much as, that 250 years have changed. There is still this very austere view of the Zeus world, his absolute supremacy, still, only questioned perhaps a little bit more than it was. Okay, so he basically, there's a lovely line. He says, "You know that punishment falls on the unruly tongue." Prometheus, however, is unfazed, declaring, "I will drink my painful cup to the dregs." Oceanus then leaves to plead with Zeus and mitigate what he can from Prometheus. The chorus then basically reiterate the power of Zeus, reminding Prometheus that nothing of men's purpose lies beyond Zeus's authority. And it's here that we're approached by a mortal maiden by the name of Eyal. That might be the wrong pronunciation, someone might say Io, who'd been pursued lustfully by, guess who? I'm sure you can guess who. Zeus, Jupiter, and subsequently turned into a cow, as you do, by Zeus as a disguise. Okay, and you can guess who she needed to be disguised from. None other than Hera herself. Okay, she'd been hounded relentlessly at this stage by a gadfly sent by Hera. Okay. What's interesting about the dialogue between Io and Prometheus is they're basically like a mirror image of each other. They're both in this absolute kind of pit. She's mortal, you have to remember, but Prometheus has so many human-like characteristics, attributes, okay, that they almost commiserate together, you know? Why should I go on living? Why not hurl myself at once down from this rocky cliff, be dashed in pieces, and find relief from all my pain? Better to die once than to suffer torment all my living days. And then Prometheus retorts that you would find it hard to bear my agonies, since I am fated not to die. Death would have brought release, but now no end to suffering is in sight for me until Zeus be deposed from sovereignty. Is this a god speaking? Or could we? It's perhaps one of the best ways that we can understand, you know, the Titans. It's this kind of like halfway point to deny these human, you know, death of a god. Okay, to bear my agonies. It's a very human suffering, almost in solidarity, perhaps, with human suffering. And it's at this point, until Zeus be deposed from sovereignty. This is quite a complex little bit, but it's basically that it's uncovered that there may be a marriage. Okay, you know, many generations down. A descendant, and it's basically, there's two things. There's a marriage, but there's also the possibility that a descendant of Io, who is in the shape of Alcmena, gives rise to a hero. That hero is Heracles, who eventually, we are told, although the writing is not there anymore because it's in one of the later stages of the Prometheia, where Heracles actually rescues Prometheus. Okay? A marriage that shall hurl him out, a throne and sovereignty into oblivion, and then the curse his father, Kronos, cursed him with the day he lost his ancient throne shall all come true. Now you have to remember that Uranus has been deposed by Kronos. Kronos has been, you know, deposed by the son of Kronos, by Zeus. There's nothing to say that it won't happen again. We never find out who that god could be. There's a tantalising possibility, some have said, that it possibly could have been Dionysus, but we never find out because the Prometheia is lost, unfortunately. Okay, but that marriage, there is evidence to suggest that it may have been a goddess by the name of Metis. Now it's here that Hermes arrives at the scene. Yeah, the herald of the gods confronts the herald of the Titans, okay? There's a very specific language I'm using there. Karl Korenye, who I think there's a little bit on Karl Korenye later, a Hungarian scholar, wrote an excellent book in the 1950s on Prometheus, okay? And he suggested that it's a great, not only the familial thing, if you look back to the tree, Atlas being the grandfather of Hermes, but Hermes and Prometheus, they share so many attributes. They're both tricksters. But in this story, Hermes is, you know, he's not the gentle god that I've kind of found him in some respects to be. He shows a much harder face. He's a herald of the god, whereas Prometheus is seen as a herald of the Titans. Hermes arrives and he wants to obviously know as much as he can about this marriage. Tell him what this marriage is, through which you boast that he shall fall from power. Now speak no clever riddles, but set forth detailed truth. Not being one to back down easily. You imagine that you hold an unassailable citadel, but I have seen 2 dynasties already hurled from those same heights, and I shall see the third, today's king, fall to earth. And this is the third, you know, this is the deposing of Zeus. Dialogue continues with Prometheus refusing to call for information, and Hermes rebuking the elder Titan for his foolish obstinacy. Hermes then explains, when a long age has passed, you will return into the light, and then the dark-winged hound of Zeus will come. the savage eagle, an uninvited banqueter, and all day long will rip your flesh in rags and feast upon your liver, gnawing it black. Once more the chorus interject, and they try and get Prometheus to reveal this secret. He doesn't. And essentially the play, we are led to believe, ends with a mechanism called Deus Ex Machina, okay, where basically Prometheus, somehow, however they would have done it, is hurled to the underworld, still chained to the rock. And that's the end of the play. Now, I just say earlier that because the Prometheia was lost, there are some tantalising words, particularly in this book. Now, I definitely can't tell you that you would definitely not find this on PDF on a drive somewhere. This guy's been dead a long, long time. You're not infringing copyright. It's an absolutely magnificent read if you can find it. Otherwise, you'll probably end up paying up a couple of £100 for it. But the only extant trilogy that we have, which gives a glimpse of what possibly could have happened in a Prometheia, was the Oresteia, also written by Aeschylus. It's beyond the subject of this. I am actually preparing a talk on the Oresteia as well, which is a fantastic trilogy, but it's beyond the scope here. But this author does give some very, very convincing, ideas on how the Prometheia could finish. But there's going to be a resolution of some sort. Either way. Now, there's many other figures and myths where we encounter Prometheus. We have Deucalion and Hera, already mentioned. Pharaonius, a mythical king of Athens with some semblance to the Prometheus archetype. The birth of Athena. But I do wish to touch just briefly on the cult of Prometheus, if we can call it a cult. Essentially, despite the influence that the figure of Prometheus held in literature and art, and I know that I've spent quite a long time talking about classical and archaic literature, Hesiod being archaic, Aeschylus being classical. His religious cult enjoyed most prominence in Athens, but was limited elsewhere. In Athens, he was worshipped alongside Athena and Hephaestus. Now, I know I've used the word tantalising a lot, but there are also some really, really interesting little clues about a possible archaic connection between Hephaestus and Prometheus, particularly in regards to the islands of Lemnos and Samothrace, where Hephaestus, obviously, another fire god, essentially. So again, kind of all this lost stuff that, just needs to be put together. There are many interesting features that link Prometheus to Hephaestus. So, how did this pan out? At that time, Athens enjoyed a number of torch races during the festival of Panathenaea in the month of August. These are relay races that began at an altar dedicated to Prometheus found in the gardens of Plato's Academia. This race passed through the area of the city known as the Keramikos, the Potter's Quarter. Okay, there will be a little bit more about Prometheus as the potter, the sculptor, and for where obviously the modern word ceramic is derived. This relay race concluded with the lighting of the sacrificial fire at the altar of Athena, patron goddess of the city, at the Acropolis. And this is directly from Paul's obviously translated Pausanias' description of Greece. In the academy is an altar of Prometheus, and they run from it to the city with burning torches. The object of the contest is to keep the torch burning during the race, for if the first runner lets his torch out, he forfeits all claim to the victory, which falls to the second instead, and so on and so on. But if the torch of the second is out also, then the third is the winner, etc. But if all their torches are extinguished, nobody wins. Now, I'm not going to talk about running, but I am going to talk a little bit about running, being a polytheist and a really, really keen runner. Quite often it is Hermes, and again, because of the kind of the association with roads and being a herald and moving the Talaria. I'm really surprised that Nike don't have a range of shoes called the Talaria. But anyway, Prometheus also does have this equal right to being a sort of patron god of runners, as it were. It's true to say that the Romans, following the Greek tradition, made more of Prometheus figulus. So this is Prometheus, the sculptor. Okay, very much the kind of potter. perhaps more than the Greeks had originally done so in their mythology, or their kind of, the mythology that really, the stories that really stick out. But within this context of late paganism and the onset of Christianity, it's a very interesting little thing here. It's not only my belief, but I think a lot of people would say that the glue that it, in many respects helped, not glue, but the kind of the ideas that basically enabled the crossover between late paganism and Christianity was very much Platonism, Neoplatonism. Okay, this idea that everything is an emanation from the one, whether or not you're a polytheist or not. If you're a hard polytheist or not, you're not going to believe that. Okay, but it was very much a transitional period. Now, quite often we hear these things as pagans about how, the church did this, that, and the other, and copied. And Olga Raggio, who was a 20th century scholar, okay, had this to say on a brilliant article, 1958 article, okay. And this was found in the 3rd century CE, so Roman, but very, very much within that kind of Christian context as well. The treatment of the creation of man corresponds in all these sarcophagi to the dualistic concept of body and soul proper to Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy. In 3 distinct phases, it shows the shaping of the body of the new man, which is performed by Prometheus in his role as sculptor. His enlivenment through fire applied to the lifeless body by a winged genius, and his animation through the intervention of Minerva, Athena, to the Romans, who brings the soul in the shape of a butterfly or bee. So another connection with Athena there, brought down into the Minerva figure, obviously Minerva being the Roman equivalent. But in the same article, she says of this, bearing in mind the genius Prometheus and Athena, on the so-called dogma sarcophagus of the Lateran Museum, the artist has represented the 3 persons of the Trinity, simultaneously blessing the new man in an odd effort to adapt an old compositional scheme to the new ideological content. So there you have it. It's just basically being borrowed, hook, line and sinker from an old compositional scheme which involved Prometheus as a sculptor, Athena as an imbuer of life, as it were. Probably the most well-known version we have today, the Prometheus archetype, as a creator, comes in the form of the notorious Dr. Frankenstein. Frankenstein is also another one that I've had to sadly cut out because it doesn't relate to in the way that I would kind of want it to. But needless to say, Shelley's creation, or the Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, there are some interesting things there. So, for instance, the creature, Dr. Frankenstein's creature, suffers in isolation. Isolation is a massive thing that we're going to come to with Prometheus. So there are these little glimpses here, but she very much sees Dr. Frankenstein as being the sculptor, the Prometheus figureless, the creator, Prometheus as a creator, however crooked that ended up being. Perhaps, a parallel there with Hesiod. She definitely would have read Hesiod, by the way, and largely down to the fact that despite the fact she was 18, she's an incredibly educated woman. And yes, sadly, that's all I'm really going to say on Frankenstein. So, as I discovered during sort of 2 years of this research, there are literally dozens of pieces of artwork that depict Prometheus from the Renaissance down. Now, I know the Renaissance is kind of one of those eras that it's a talk or 10 talks in and of itself, but we do have this kind of in many respects, we do have to thank the kind of the high and mighty people of the Renaissance for passing down a lot of this stuff, because a lot of this stuff just wouldn't have come down to us if it hadn't have been for those. So here we have Peter Paul Rubens, 1577 to 1640. This doesn't, I'd suggest you check this. It's an absolutely beautiful painting. Gioacchino Assaretto, similar sort of time frame, early 17th century. And this one, which is one of my favourites, Jean Delville. What the interesting thing about most art on Prometheus, whether it's 19th century, whether it's 16th century, some earlier, 14th century, I believe, they tend to depict Prometheus in either one of 2 poses. Either he is in absolute wretchedness, chained to a rock with his liver being eaten by an eagle, in distress, in very human distress. Or he's very much like the Delville Prometheus here, this glory character, this free character. Okay, there's another famous one, which I didn't put here, with Prometheus holding the fire. And it's kind of like this glory and wretchedness. It's this wonderful paradox that you get with Prometheus. Glory and wretchedness, or wretchedness in glory. Okay, very, very human again. So pretty much from the Renaissance through to the Baroque, through to the Romanticist era, we have some wonderful artwork. Okay, and I definitely, if it interests you to go through and have a look at that. Now, a quick sort of an off here. Paradise Lost, 1667. Now, one of the most famous poems in the English language. And whilst it doesn't deal with Prometheus directly, its central protagonist, Satan, has drawn many a parallel, not lost on the academic world. There are a great many parallels between this work and the pious belief of the author. If any of you know anything about John Milton, he was writing after the Restoration. He was blind. His own cynicism, his own desperation with the way that the monarchy had been restored. He was a firm parliamentarian and a Puritan. Many people think that he actually scored an own goal, particularly William Blake and Shelley both thought he'd scored an own goal. Okay, by essentially portraying Satan not only as a central protagonist in Paradise Lost, but also, and it definitely wouldn't have been his intention to make him look like a hero, or the hero, much like Prometheus. So he's of a similar heroic calibre to Satan precisely because of their mutual and active disobedience in their own respective myths. The Swiss psychoanalyst, I'm sure Jung doesn't need any introduction, suggested that Milton's Satan, through the author's own eyes, was a true principium individuatoris, an unworthy, rebellious characteristic in Milton's time. One other little interesting thing here, I'm going to forget the name of the scholar, but there are all sorts of interesting things, not only linking Prometheus to Hephaestus, I've already said, but also its use as well. Now, there is this very, very odd idea put forward by one that actually, that in a strange sort of way, for the context in which they existed, they could almost be seen as siblings, squabbling siblings, and that actually, where their real issue, the real issue between Zeus and Prometheus, was the fact that both of them exercised what could be seen as nous. I'm not going to be able to. I'm afraid I'm not an ancient Greek speaker, but it's this idea of knowledge, this idea of worthy counsel upon the world, and that was thought to be one scholar's idea of how Zeus and Prometheus came into conflict with each other. They were both basically good at the same thing. Perhaps Hermes and Prometheus again, share all these attributes. And Carl Carregno, who I mentioned earlier, in a totally separate, in an essay actually on the figure of Niobe. See what this says here. Two mythological beings who are likewise siblings, for the beginning of things were the same for gods and mortal human beings, undertake a common task. The one is in possession of all-seeing nous, of sun-like understanding, yet he is tricked by the other one. As punishment, the other one is chained to a cliff between heaven and earth. This is an African fairy tale. Is it too far-fetched then here to draw a parallel with the brothers Christ and Satan? Or indeed to consider Zeus an original sibling of Prometheus for the context in which we're talking? Scholar E.R. Bevan, as I say, that's his name, it's down there, I did put it in, E.R. Bevan, and he again suggested that it was to do with this wise counsel. So we've got Zeus and Prometheus. This is the artwork I was talking about. Holding aloft a fire. It's very, very glorious, really full of, glorious. It's the complete opposite of kind of wretchedness, as it were. And we come on to Shelley. Okay, and you'll hear a bit more about Shelley right at the end of this talk. Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1792 to 1822, who in his Prometheus Unbound of 1820 gave reply to the Prometheus Bound of Aeschylus and reanimated the original mythology in the Prometheus myth, portraying Prometheus instead almost as this Christ-like saviour, opposed to earlier traditions of Hesiod, who suggested he was this crooked trickster. Shelley kept Prometheus alive, and you'll be hearing, as I say, more about him. Moving sort of further on and away from this, the script I have here, there are, as I've said, a great many human characteristics of Prometheus. But one of the things that's really, really striking alongside his very human sentiments, particularly in the Prometheus Bound, I don't think Hesiod really would have given much attention or concern or care or empathy for the very human feelings of Prometheus in his Theogony or Works and Days. But that's certainly evident in Aeschylus, the Prometheus Bound. But one of the things that really is striking is isolation. Now, I mentioned March 2020. It will be sculpted onto our memories, unfortunately, forevermore. Okay, but for a lot of people, it was a time of real isolation. Now, admittedly, 2 years of lockdown or 30,000 years chained to a rock is not advisable. But it's also true to say that as witches and as practitioners, we do, whether by design or by default, end up at times quite isolated. It's sometimes difficult, believing the things that you do. It can be quite an isolating thing. Prometheus obviously being in a wilderness, I would imagine the vast majority of us love the idea of going into the wilderness. This nurturing time alone. And whilst there is suffering with Prometheus, there is also this idea that actually through his suffering, through the time that he spends chained to the rock, going through all these human emotions, that there is in the end this kind of, I don't want to use the word, but this kind of salvation, but it's all about his own glory, his own sort of liberation from his wretchedness. As I was saying, that paradox between human wretchedness and that flip side, which is the glory and the kind of the power of someone like Prometheus who does all this and does it all for mankind. So isolation is a huge time in contemplation, perhaps away from the hustle and bustle of a busy, impacted life. One of the things that did cross my mind was I remember writing something recently about Sappho, the poet Sappho, and about the mythological Orpheus being mythological, Sappho being very flesh and blood. If there's a flesh and blood equivalent to this element of the Prometheus myth, it would probably be the Roman poet Ovid, who made a fatal mistake by writing something that offended the Emperor Augustus. And Ovid, who was this terrible flirt, a real socialite, was banished forever from his beloved Rome, and he spent the rest of his days, and he didn't last long because away from Rome he was nobody, in I think in what is now modern day Georgia on the Black Sea. So he'd be very much kind of flesh and blood equivalent of this kind of human angle of Prometheus. Prometheus the Rebel then is worth considering as a very human Titan god, but I would ask you to ask yourselves this: is he functional within a system of power, or without? And when I say or without, outside of, beyond. Does protest, dissent in the contemporary world, lend itself to the improvement of a democracy, or should it be considered an adversary that wishes to see the ultimate toppling of said power? Now, we're told all the time, I don't get too political here, but we're told all the time, that protesters, whatever they're doing, whether they're kind of environmental or animal rights or anti-austerity protesters, we're basically told in the press all the time these people are a pain in the arse and that they're an affront to democracy. I think one idiot journalist even called some of these people fascists, that they were the ones imposing their will. And of course, this is not the reality and never could be. The reality is that in many respects, if we're going to have the kind of democracy that we have, protest exercises democracy, it expands democracy, it matures democracy. I don't need to tell you how many things have been wrought from base level direct action whatever those things may be. So it's very, very easy for every generation to dismiss protest as something, a new fad, something that young people do, and then by the time they get to the age of 45, they get a big house and start voting to, Tory or whatever. I mean, I've heard it before. But the reality is this, and I'd really ask if there's one thing you take away, and I'm sure most of you will know this anyway, that dissent is ancient. It's always been there. Whether we see Prometheus as a figure who essentially is functional for the Zeus world, or whether we see him as outside of that, he can't be ignored. His very presence means that dissent is enshrined, sacred almost. And essentially, can power ever be absolute? As Hesiod and many world leaders would suggest today, and I am drawing direct comparison with Hesiod, your austere Hesiod. You had no time for the wily Prometheus, and I'm drawing a parallel between him and the world leaders today. But can power ever be absolute when dissent is present? Is use as supreme as it's been made out to be when Prometheus is able to outwit him? And I'm going to leave the rest to Shelley. As wonderful a character as Prometheus could be and may well become a lifetime of study and contemplation, but there are so many things here touched upon that could easily fill a lecture or two. But this last stanza from Percy by Shelley's Prometheus Unbound sums up much of what I consider to be the paradox of autocratic power that will always stand in contrast to our own individual human potential. Thank you for the fire you have given to us, Prometheus. This is the last stanza from the Prometheus Unbound from Shelley. To suffer woes which hope thinks infinite, to forgive wrongs darker than death or night, to defy power which seems omnipotent, to love and bear, to hope till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates, neither to change nor falter nor repent. This, like thy glory, Titan, is to be good, great and joyous, beautiful and free. This is alone life, joy, empire and victory. Thank you for listening.
Rigid keeper of the hearth, guardian flame and healing water, sacred shield protecting me, praise and love I offer thee. Blessed Brigid, keeper of the heart, 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 blessed Brigid, shield blessed shield protecting me, blessed Brigid, keep 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 blessed Brigid, keep protecting me, 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 blessed Brigid, keep blessed Brigid, keep protecting me, blessed Brigid. sages and shield protecting me. Blessed sages and shield protecting me. Blessed sages and shield protecting me. Sages and shield protecting water. Saves and shield protecting me. Praise and love I offer thee.
Oh, little flake of snow, onto the earth you fall, painting it all aglow as the darkness rolls over the hills wide, blessing us good night, lit by the candlelight. Our little hearts on flight, our little hearts fly. Oh, little flake of snow, onto the earth you fall, painting it all aglow as the darkness rolls over the hills, blessing us good night. Lit by the candlelight, dream of days long and bright. In my heart, safe and sound, sweet baby lullaby. Lit by the candlelight, dream of days long and bright. In my heart, safe and sound, sweet baby lullaby. Sun will one day warm us up again. Dream away, the winter is sure to fade, and we'll rise to a brighter day.
I was sitting there at the Wild Witchcraft Conference and I found that talk absolutely fascinating, and I hope you did too, my friends. Afterwards you heard Devotional to Brighid by Amiel, and that was followed by Little Flake of Snow by Ekrem Eli Phoenix. Two great names there, and thank you both for sending in your work. It really is appreciated. And don't forget, you can find links to the artists featured on the show in the show notes. Spring has well and truly sprung. Here in our garden, the hawthorn tree has been in full May. The birds have been nesting, the sun shining, and the green of Beltane is lush and vibrant. Yeah, I'm oozing a little bit, I know. But welcome the May Queen. I can just feel the land, so full of life, vitality and fertility, and it brings out those qualities in me as well. Absolutely my favourite time of year, to be sure. But this music means we are approaching the end of the show. But before I go, let's have the results of last month's competition. The prize was a copy of Rob Wildwood's new book, Magical Britain, and the question I asked was, arguably Britain's most famous magical site is a ring of stones on Salisbury Plain in the southwest of England. What is that ring of stones commonly known as? Well, that's an easy one. The answer was, of course, Stonehenge. And the first name drawn from the hat and winner of that brilliant book is Hex Nottingham from Norfolk, USA. Congratulations, Hex. I know that you will love that book, and it will be with you as soon as the post will allow. The prize this month is a new book by Professor Alice Roberts called Ancestors, The Prehistory of Britain in 7 Burials, and it is an amazing book that I am reading right now and just thought to myself, man, I would love one of you to win this. So the question I'd like you to answer is this. The ancient time period known as the New Stone Age is known by another name. What is that name? The ancient time period known as the New Stone Age is known by another name. What is that name? It's a little bit more tricky than last month, but if you don't know, a quick Google search will tell you. Email your answer along with your full postal address to podcast@druidry.org, and one of you will win a copy of that amazing book. Well, that is it for DruidCast episode 181. I will see you here again next month for episode 182, but until then, have a great month, my friends, and I wish you all peace and blessed be. Goodbye.